All right, today we are going to talk a little bit about civil liberties and civil rights. And I find that oftentimes our students, even adults, really struggle with the difference between these two terms. And yet they are, in fact, very different and have different groundings for them in the U.S. Constitution. So, what I thought we might do today is break up this topic by looking at some headings and putting those into our notes. And as always, it's really good for us to start with some basic definitions. So, a civil liberty is your individual and constitutional protections that are guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. And I think what is important in understanding it's a protection, the question is a protection from whom or from what? And if you were to pull out your pocket constitutions, you might see that oftentimes there's a reference to Congress shall make no, Congress shall not do. As a result, a civil liberty is a protection against one's lawmaking bodies like Congress. We think about it as a protection against now the states and even your local communities from infringing upon these guarantees that you have in the Bill of Rights. I know it's confusing. It's not called the Bill of Liberties or the Bill of Rights. I don't know. They should have asked us. But nonetheless, just try to make sure that you're not confusing those concepts. So, an example of a liberty is a right to a speedy and public trial. An example of a liberty is the fact that the government has to have a warrant if they're going to do a search of your home. Now, there's some exceptions to that, and that's what we'll be talking a lot about over the few remaining lessons we have are these exceptions. But there are exceptions. So a civil liberty can be found, therefore, in the Bill of Rights, which is your first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. So if we think about, okay, if a civil liberty is my protection from a lawmaking body like Congress, i.e., most people will say the government, it's a pretty broad term. But if it's my protection from that, then, well, what is a civil right? Well, many of you, as you took U.S. History 2 last year, you examined civil rights. And so if we think about what those are, it's really your ability to be free from discrimination. And why would you be discriminated against? It's because you belong to a certain category. So if you think back to what you learned in U.S. History 2 about the civil rights movement, these are by and large populations of people who are seeking to create equality in society because they see a level of discrimination that's emerging. And much of that discrimination, it was legal, meaning like it was occurring from the law. It was later found, of course, to be illegal, but ultimately that's what civil rights are, is it's your ability to be free from discrimination because you belong to a certain group. So I have an example here of a civil right, right? A civil right is not being discriminated because of being wheelchair bound or not being discriminated because you were Native American. So for example, let's say that you are a student who has mobility issues and you have classes that are located on the second floor of Woodland High School. And yet the elevator is broken. So you can't actually access your classes. And then imagine, if you would, that the school says, this isn't accurate, I just want to be clear, like it's a scenario, that the school says, hey, don't worry, you don't need to go to classes for the next few weeks. Now, while on paper, you might be thinking, whoa, I don't have to go to classes. The reality is you're being prevented from accessing an education because you're in a wheelchair, right? You'll be missing out on learning over the period of time that you are in a wheelchair because of your mobility issues. And as a result, your civil rights are being infringed upon. So those are some examples of ways in which populations are discriminated against. When we were learning about the civil rights movement in U.S. history too, when you were juniors, we oftentimes frame the civil rights movement around the rights for African American populations to be able to access truly full voting rights in this country, to ensure that they are able to access public facilities like everybody else would be able to. Perhaps when you were studying that unit, you looked at additional populations such as the Native American movement, the women's movement, or like the Chicano Latino movement, specifically to populations that were seeking civil rights as well. But those are your definitions of a civil liberty and a civil right. So let's talk about some background. When the Constitution was written, it was concerned with limiting the powers of the federal government, right? That's the whole point of the Constitution, is to limit the powers of the federal government. It is to put limitations or boundaries on those powers. But the Constitution does have some provisions that actually protect individual rights. We didn't spend a lot of time on these, but for example, there's the writ of habeas corpus. It means that's in the Constitution. It's not in your civil liberties or any of the amendments. But like habeas corpus means you have a right to ask a judge why you're being held in a jail. Like, what's the evidence that the law has on you that's forced you to be jailed? That's in the heart of the Constitution. So the Constitution does have some provisions that protect individual liberties and rights. But a group at the time when the Constitution was being written and thereafter when it was being adopted, a group called the Anti-Federalists felt that there were other individual rights that needed to be protected from the government. They were just concerned that the states were not unilaterally, meaning all of them, extending liberties to all peoples. And so this population called the Anti-Federalists kind of pushed back on it. And they really desired and pushed for and eventually won the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights was added to the U.S. Constitution in 1791, just a few years after the official adoption or ratification of the U.S. Constitution. I always like to say and remind students that at the time when the Bill of Rights was written, again, its goal was to limit the power of the government over the people. In other words, it's protecting the people from their government. So if you look at Amendment 1, for example, where the intention behind Amendment 1 is to protect your right to free exercise of religion, meaning your right to, or liberty, let's use that word, to exercise your religion as need be without Congress creating limitations on that. But it's not really until later that the First Amendment and all of your liberties, for the most part, there's an exception, applies to all aspects of government, not just the national government, but the states. So if we think about things like the First Amendment, it says Congress shall not, or Congress is prohibited from. But really, in that context, we know that today that also means that, like, the state of Washington can't infringe upon you, or Cowlitz County can't infringe upon your rights. Not just the state. We'll go to the Second Amendment, which is one that's oftentimes talked about. It's not necessarily that Congress can't prohibit the right to keep and bear arms, but rather that extends to states and localities like your county, like your city. So you guys know, right, that there are some limitations that are put on place on some of your amendments. So how is it that we get to that point? I think that's really important to examine. Like, are your liberties absolute? That's the final question I'll lead you with. And I think that's really up, we know it's really up to the judiciary or the judicial branch to determine what limitations are actually placed on your liberties and eventually on your rights. They determine those parameters or those boundaries, which is one of the biggest things that the U.S. Supreme Court does, right? The U.S. Supreme Court hears roughly 70 cases a year, and many of those are dealing very specifically with civil liberties issues. And part of that is because the court feels like they have to figure out these parameters or these boundaries of what's allowable and what's not allowable, what is falls in line with what the founders of our country desired, or what's more up to date with our needs today. So I'm just going to leave you on that note. Hopefully today you've been able to understand a little bit more about the difference between a civil liberty and a civil right. Hopefully you understand why the Bill of Rights was created at the time that it was. And then hopefully we've been able to come back to this third bullet point and recognize that the Bill of Rights today applies to states, it applies to localities like our community, and that it's up to the judicial branch to determine what those limitations are.